Hello, everyone, and welcome to Political Party. I'm Hamish.
And I'm Tim.
Today in the show, firstly, we will be talking about the government's data retention. We will have a debate and discussion on this issue, introducing metadata and then introducing the bill. Then, next segment in the show is Blundergate, a humorous look at some mistakes made by our politicians. Thirdly, less sexy than ISIS, a little segment about important events in the Middle East that have been overshadowed by the growing ISIS boogeyman. And finally, political news as told by The Onion.
Thanks, Hamish. This is Tim, and today we're going to start off our show with a debate about data retention and metadata. What is that? So, Hamish, tell me a bit about metadata firstly.
Well, metadata is a type of data that is basically, it's data that refers to your location, your emails that you send, like who you send them to, and internet links that you click on, how long you click on them for, those kinds of things. It's often used by corporations to help determine what ads will be targeted at us. You may have seen those targeted ads on Facebook. And it's important to note that metadata does not actually refer to the contents of communications, but simply the nature of the communications and who they are to.
That's right. So that brings us to data retention, which is sort of different from metadata. Metadata it can be collected by Google, it can be collected by Facebook. Metadata specifically refers to the burden and the onus being on the internet service providers to retain all data, that is time of messages sent, where you sent it from, where you're accessing internet points from, where your bank is, where you're accessing your money from. They have to retain that data for 2 years by law. Now that sounds, it doesn't sound like there's anything inherently wrong with that, but because, as we'll talk about, they're using the motive of terrorism and national security to protect through this. What are your thoughts?
Well, it's quite interesting that this sort of wide-scale public surveillance is allowed to happen just a few years after the Edward Snowden revelations and the major public outcry.
That's an interesting point, because that brings me to the nitty-gritty of the bill that we're talking about. So it looks at locations, it looks at names, and it looks at cables. So by cable, I mean you, person X, and other person Y. Your communications to each other will be monitored, as in you could perhaps have your phones tapped, but they cannot retain that data. It's not required for them to keep the contents of your messages, but rather what's going to happen is that they are going to collect where you sent it from, what time you sent it, and how often you're communicating with each other. The interesting and controversial part of this bill is that there's no judicial oversight.
Yes, this could be a major problem. Under this bill, any government official will have the ability to examine your data without a warrant.
Yep. So at the moment, this data it's not compulsory for internet service providers to store this data, but they do, and they store it in mass amounts. At the moment, you need a warrant to be able to access that information if you're part of a law enforcement agency, which is what's going to happen under the new bill. Except under the new bill, all you need is a two-sided A4 sheet of paper that applies to the internet service provider. That supersedes the warrant. So what happens is you are sending that piece of paper to the ISP, and they are required to hand that information over to you for national security purposes, or so they want to call it.
Yeah, this is pretty scary stuff. And it's suddenly the possibility that criminal networks or fraudsters or even foreign spies could become low-level government officials and still access this data.
That's very Illuminati of you to say there, Hamish.
We've got our embassies were full of agents. Our government agencies were probably full of them. Our intelligence services,
So, on a more democratic level, at a more Australian level, what we're talking about here is the implications of having no judicial oversight over the retention of data. It is, it's merely for security purposes, or so they say. Only law enforcement agencies can send the application to access this information. What happens is, with no judicial oversight, you have no fail-safe and you have no checks and balances on the power being used by the officials. So not only is that undemocratic, but at the moment, it is hugely unpopular and it's unconstitutional as well, which could land the Tony Abbott government in a lot more trouble.
Exactly.
Yep. So in our last couple of minutes before we go to our first song, we're going to talk about state intrusion. Does the state have the right to interfere based on the based on the security needs of the people.
Well, I can't help but feel that this is probably the wrong way of approaching looking after the security needs of people, and it was probably a policy conducted in order to fulfill the ever-growing government desire for more information on those who live within its jurisdiction. So I think that for me, there are two problems with this bill. Firstly, it's massively disproportionate because, I mean, you're conducting surveillance. You're conducting this surveillance on every citizen, and any citizen could fall victim to having their fall victim. Any citizen could have their metadata accessed by a government official at any time, and you wouldn't know about it. And another issue I have is that it really isn't very effective, even in countries where we have seen these kinds of data retention schemes happen. In fact, in Australia, the police were able to use a warrant to access metadata, but that didn't stop the Sydney cafe siege, even though the perpetrator was known to police and should have been more closely watched. So it's not just disproportional, it's ineffective.
It was sparked a lot recently, the debate over this bill, because the the customs officers responded to two 16-year-old kids trying to travel to Tajikistan who were then going to cross the border, the various borders, and go and fight with ISIS.
Seriously?
Good one. So what we're talking about here is big government. That is, a conservative government policy whose aim is to attempt to regulate and intervene into the private sphere. The private sphere being who you're messaging when you're sending those messages, etc. This is good, firstly, because we as a society have collectively decided that we're going to relinquish part of our liberty in order for the government to be able to protect us from each other. That's basic liberal democracy.
It's true, but how much of that liberty have we really given up? I mean, things have changed quite a lot lately. I mean, you couldn't really conduct this kind of mass surveillance with letters, so that made it okay back in the day, whereas now the government just has access to such powerful information processing tools, such powerful means of storing them, that I really feel that this level of data retention and intrusion of the private sphere by government really goes beyond what is envisaged in the social contract.
Yep. So, that's before we go to our first song, I'll leave you with this quote from Green Senator from West Australia, Scott Ludlam. He said that technology has overrun our ability to enforce law, whilst arguing against the bill. So, in an interesting turn of events, we'll have a look at the governance of technology after we go to our first song. So, without further ado, this song is not anti-American. It's anti-war, and it's anti-media control over the information we hear about war. This is American Idiot. And we're back. So in Block 2 today, Hamish, we're going to talk about the Trans-Pacific Partnership and its relation to the Data Retention Act.
Fair enough.
All right, so let's talk about that. What is the Trans-Pacific Partnership? It is a multinational branded as a free trade agreement. The Trans-Pacific Partnership is being championed by banking, pharmaceutical, tobacco, software, consumer electronics, and media corporations.
Electrifying.
And so they're sending through these, they're pressuring governments from 12 different countries. That includes Brazil, that includes the United States, who are also as hesitant to introduce this bill as the United Kingdom, but not necessarily as frightened as the Australian government, because the Australian government seems pretty keen to push this through as soon as possible.
Well, that's pretty bad. See, the issue with this, a big issue, is that its contents have not been exposed to the public. In fact, the negotiators have done everything they can to keep the public firmly out of this partnership. We've only known about its contents thanks to WikiLeaks.
Yep.
Sounds like they really need to be more specific about the details.
So what we've got here is that this is how it works. They're pressuring the government to sign this Trans-Pacific Partnership. What that does is that copyright content is going to be monitored by your ISPs. This is one of the many things that it does. It's also going to shape environmental policy and leeway in terms of hydrocarbon pollution, and it's going to affect labor conditions in a lot of countries as well. But what we're going to talk about is the copyright content and the ISPs section of this, because it's going to be relevant to our data retention point in this debate. So copyrighted content, including your data history. This is a key distinction between the Data Retention Act. Your history, as well as all of the material you look at online, is potentially going to be monitored by your internet service provider. What that means is that corporations are now able to sue the government in foreign courts behind closed doors.
Wow, that's pretty dog.
And so what happens there is that the corporations are going to say, firstly, poor government oversight over the use of people's internet that is not blocking like the Pirate Bay, etc., is leading to them losing money on their media content or on their music or on their ads that are being shared in countries that wasn't copyrighted for.
But this is an extremely unjust notion that undermines the very nature of our democracy. We vote governments in based on their promises to protect us from the abuses of corporations, and yet here they are able to sue the government for lost profits caused by government policies designed to protect its people.
And there was a court case in which one of these corporations has already sued the Canadian government for one of these issues, and they reached $500 million settlement at the end of the case.
Fracking hell.
So what that means is that not only are they suing for remuneration for the media content that they've lost over time, but moreover, what's happening is that they're suing governments based on the loss of their projected earnings that are supposed to accrue due to the piracy that governments seemingly let happen.
Yeah, there's all manner of issues about this. I mean, first of all, it's been proven that a sale lost by a pirated copy is not necessarily a lost sale. This could open the way for digital entertainment providers to abuse this by saying, well, our projected profits with this, but piracy took them away. Those pirated copies were not necessarily guaranteed sales, so you're just making up profits from thin air.
Yep.
I'd also like to point out that some companies have extremely unrealistic expectations. I mean, one of the latest Square Enix games, the last Tomb Raider, was actually considered a commercial failure because it sold less than like 10 million units.
That's unusual.
10 million. That's an awful lot, eh?
Yeah. So, big corporations suing governments for the fun of it.
And here's the thing. Thanks to this new data retention scheme, the framework to implement these copyright requirements has already been laid by the Abbott government, and it has also been laid by the UK government.
That's right. So, what I said before, American Idiot, was Senator Scott Ludlam in response to this bill has said that technology has overrun our ability to enforce law. Is the Trans-Pacific Partnership the government's last grab to attempt to regulate a multinational technological asset in the internet? Are they losing control of the internet? And what we should talk about, are the governments responsible for regulating the internet on behalf of corporations that don't base in Australia?
Yes. Now, there have been efforts made in this direction before. You may remember the Stop Online Piracy Act and the Protect Intellectual Property Act in the USA that allowed such things as DNS blocking for websites. However, these two legislations were shot down by a massive online activist campaign, but people reckoned it was only a matter of time before the government tried something like this again.
So what this does though is, for me personally, it's about stopping online freedom. It's about distinguishing things as pirated or not so. We're no longer going to be able to watch Game of Thrones on the internet anymore. And moreover, even though that may be illegal, the internet regulation is still breaching our freedom of information, our freedom of access. And this has dire consequences on public opinion. If they were to monitor and punish people for using online piracy, there would be...
Exactly. Once they've started up with online piracy, soon enough, these policies leave the government with so much power that someone in government could say, oh, well, someone's advocating this issue. They may be a commie or they may be a terrorist. We'd better suppress them. This could lead to censorship.
Yeah. And that big government idea, that premise that the government has to intervene, that premise that the government is in control of the liberties that we exercise, it should be more of a small government thing. So what small government means is a more flexible and a more efficient government where they stop intervening in the public sphere, where they stop telling you, you cannot purchase and use marijuana. They should stop you from, engaging in, violent sex acts, which are currently all subject to different laws, right? But the individual liberty of people should have the freedom to be able to choose what sort of rights they want to succeed and what sort of rights they want to relinquish.
Problem with leaving it to the individual is that some individuals are kind of unstable and may choose rights that affect the well-being of other people.
That's a good point, Hamish. And on that point of instability, our next song comes to us from Muse. This is the new one from Muse. What it is, it's about mind control and how militaries teach people
You can all muse over that.
to mindlessly kill without thinking it through. This is Psycho. The right to be forgotten. This is our closing block about the whole idea of data retention and your ability to control your own identity online. The right to be forgotten it's a precedent that's been existing in the EU since 2006 in a specific case regarding Argentina. And what it is, it's a precedent that says search engines must delete any search results if requested by everyday citizens, by me, by you. It could be by corporations, it could be by ISIS, it could be by governments, it could be by corporations.
Fun fact, I'd like to point out that this principle was upheld in 2014 by the European Court of Justice when, funnily enough, in the same year, the United Kingdom introduced its data retention scheme that same year.
That's true.
Good old UK.
So information that could be irrelevant, outdated, unconsenting. It's basically about what I'm going to get to. In our debate in a second. It's about your ability to determine the development of your own identity online. It says that the internet is not forgetting. The internet never forgets anything. You make one mistake, you're perhaps imprisoned for stealing or something, and they report it in a local newspaper that has their article online. You are officially condemned to a life of stigmatization because of that policy.
Exactly.
So what this does is it affects like multiple areas. Like, for example, it could make it very easy or very difficult to pirate information online. Bad press and arrests can be siphoned out of the public sphere by anyone who is perhaps in a position where they have, got some cases of defamation and they wanted to clear out some information off the internet. This mostly refers to copyright violations and intellectual property claims, which we'll go into.
Sounds like they have the copyright idea.
Okay, so quickly, I'm going to champion the moral side of this, and then Hamish is going to fuck me up with the practicality side. So, morally, all data that you put online, this is the ideal of this principle. Anything you put online, you should be able to take away. You should, in the most ideal sense, not exist on the internet. Your digital footprint can be removed by request, and just from search engines though, right? So the Wall Street Journal can post something about Barack Obama, and his office can remove that link. But that piece of information can't be removed from that journal's newspaper,
Surely they'll
right?
be barracking for its retention.
You're loaded today, Hamish.
Yeah.
So it's about the internet never forgets. It's about the smallest thing can stigmatize you for life and your entire legacy can be ruined. For example, this can be someone who's had embarrassing photos posted of them on Facebook when they were 15, and now what they're doing is they want to take back control of that.
They want to get a job, so they don't want their employers to see these pictures.
Exactly right. So, the EU has created this principle in their highest court, and they have upheld it continuously. So, you should be able to retract all of your information offline, and you should determine the development of your own personal autonomy. It's a very liberal and very ideal, very moral ideal.
Yes, it is very
Tell me
ideal.
why it's wrong.
It is very ideal because it would be extremely hard to uphold. But first of all, I'd just like to make a comment here. I feel like this bill should only really apply to stuff that you didn't upload but other people did. Because, quite frankly, any educated person should go onto the internet knowing that it is an extremely public sphere and knowing that any information you upload can just be spread like wildfire. Which brings me to my next point. While this may be a lovely ideal, there's simply no way to implement it. A few of you may have seen that one photo of Beyonce where she looks really terrible that she wanted to remove from the internet. However, this was impossible because all it took was one person right-clicking on that image and going save as, and suddenly the image cannot be removed from the internet. That person could just repost it whenever, and no amount of copyright strikes or suing or whatever is going to stop them, simply because there will be so many people who would be able to do this. And thanks to the revolutionary communications enabled by the internet, they'd be able to coordinate such large-scale action. So, quite frankly, in all the practicality of this scheme to be able to remove data from the internet at your own leisure is extremely difficult thanks to the viral nature of things on the internet and thanks to the self-replicating abilities of its users. Well, not self-replicating, but you get the point.
We're cloning people now.
Almost. We're cloning people's identities, and that has happened.
Google has, since the creation of this precedent in 2006, they have received over 40 million requests, 75% of which have been over copyright violations.
Well, damn.
Yeah, so they've released statistics about this. I'm not going to go into it because politics is dry enough as it is, and we're going to try and keep this interesting.
Yeah.
40 million requests. I think only 72,000 have been upheld.
The thing is, a problem with this issue is that it would surely that the right to be forgotten would be upheld in a public court, and by going to a public court, you are inherently ensuring that whatever transgression you committed or picture you uploaded will be immortalized and remembered for all time as part of the judicial records. Good work.
Yeah. So, you say it's impractical, and to a degree it is. But do you think it's important that this precedent exists, or do you think that people's identity online should be out of their control?
It's a tough slope. I mean, on the one hand, morally, you're definitely right here. People should be able to control their image, but there are also potential implications of this scheme, like censorship, like ensuring our corporate overlords have maximum control over us. I find welcome our new corporate overlords when they arrive, but yeah, like the potential for abuse with this principle is definitely there, and I think it would be better to respect our freedoms in this case.
Yep. So it's interesting you say that because the implications can go even further.
Well,
And because we're all edgy and controversial, let's do that. What if ISIS wants to delete all their bad press? What if ISIS is able to control their online identity by exploiting this right to be forgotten precedent so that all people see is their Hollywood-like productions and people see all of their, great stuff that they're doing in communities, and they end up using that third degree intellectual power to exert control over politics?
well, thankfully for all of us, this principle only applies in the EU, who aren't exactly sympathetic towards ISIS. So, but all joking aside, that is a scary thought, and it's entirely possible.
Good one. So let's bring this back to the bill. This data retention is a very slippery slope. Ultimately, what it is it's governments trying to intervene in an uncontrollable world of technology.
Yes.
It's like the right to know about someone if they're a criminal. We could lose that. The right to, be able to find out if people in our community have committed atrocious acts, like for example, a pedophile trying to remove all their bad press on Google.
So essentially, one society is going too far in intruding into our rights and knowing about what we did personally. The other one is going too far in trying to protect the identities of individuals.
Yeah. So ultimately, we're making that concession, but what the Data Retention Act does, the Data Retention Bill that's happening in Parliament at the moment, they want security and public safety. And in the state of affairs as it is right now, there's not really anything inherently wrong with it because your rights aren't tangibly being infringed upon.
It's true. The right to information is not a right protected by any Australian declaration.
And I think people would be willing to sacrifice what time they sent that text message to Laura so they could, have that protection from people coming back from ISIS overseas and trying to intervene in Australia.
Surely it's still something of a disproportionate reaction, though.
Absolutely.
But such is life.
And on the idea of big government and disproportionate action, our next song comes from Rock God / featuring Myles Kennedy. This song is about a conscientious objector. This is The Dissident. We are back.
What up? And this week on Blundergate, Tony Abbott and Goebbels. Tony Abbott referring to Bill Shorten and defining his policies as being rather Goebbels-like. Now, this isn't really going to shorten his lead in the polls. So essentially, what happened was Tony Abbott used this term, and then a Labor minister, Mr. Dreyfus, who is Jewish, got extremely upset about the mention of Goebbels, naturally, because he's Jewish and, the whole Holocaust thing. So
Dr. Goebbels being the Third Reich's Minister for Propaganda.
he was very effective at his job, but his job was pretty despicable. So, anyhow, Mr. Dreyfus got up and walked out of Parliament he didn't walk out of Parliament. He was ejected from Parliament by our Speaker, Bronwyn Bishop, and another Jewish Labour member left in protest.
Here's the soundbite.
Madam Speaker, that is the truth. Now, Madam Speaker, what did the Leader of the Opposition say? What did the Leader of the Opposition say? He said, we have brought the budget
member for
back to
Charlton will
surplus
leave under
on time.
94A.
Not once.
The Dr. Goebbels of economic policy. We have...
Ladies and gentlemen, this is the stable government that was promised.
This is the Prime Minister of Australia calling our opposition leader a Nazi propaganda minister, and that kind of connotation is
Funny, I wouldn't give Bill Shorten that much credit for being a good minister.
normally Tony Abbott has to be told that he's made a mistake, but as we're about to hear, he knew he fucked up pretty quickly.
I withdraw, Madam Speaker.
Dear. Now, what's rather ironic is that this same minister who got kicked out, Mr. Dreyfus, also referred to Abbott as conducting Goebbelian hypocrisy, I think the word was.
Really? Interesting. So, as we said, Joseph Goebbels was the Minister of Propaganda in the Third Reich, Nazi Germany. And as we found with our friend Tony Abbott, he's had a bit of a history with links to the Third Reich in Parliament, hasn't he?
Yeah, he has. He's caused a whole lot of trouble.
You went there.
I did.
In February, in Question Time, being asked about his submarine program, which I'm sure we'll speak about in future weeks, he said that the Labour leader was creating a Holocaust in defence jobs. I
really
shit you not,
torpedoed.
that's a quote.
Really torpedoed that notion.
So on that call, Tony Abbott responded in a couple of ways. Firstly, he said, I withdraw, Madam Speaker. He said that 5 times. And, Labour leaders all on the front bench standing up, pointing at him, yelling at him, trying to, chase him down with a trident.
A trident? Really? I guess that would have got their point across.
And, so he spoke to the media after Question Time and said that, who would blame him? Because it was the nature of that debate was incredibly immature. There were a lot of references being hurled across the floor, and a lot of leadership authority being questioned. Our speaker was constantly spoken over, and it took I think this video, it took her 4 minutes to gain quorum in the House.
It's actually a pretty scary thought that the legislative power of this country, and probably a bunch of other countries, resides with such a juvenile arrangement of individuals.
Look, I don't necessarily blame him. It's a bad call, and he's got to get his shit together. But, Tony Abbott, it was a very immature debate. He's got to stop making these calls because he's got to realize that he's the face of this country. But
it's true.
It's in an immature moment of debate, in the heat of the moment in Australian Parliament, which we know is not necessarily the most intellectual of conversations, we get somewhat of a series of rants that come out of these leaders, and whether or not they're effective or not is...
all the same, these leaders still do need to watch their language somewhat.
That's true. This is where we... this segment, Blundergate, is going to continue throughout the weeks. What it is we
examine some of the humorous mistakes made by our politicians.
And we laugh at them.
Yes.
So... haha. This is where... This is ultimately where we decide that, we're not necessarily... Okay, so to identify, we're not going to pick on Tony Abbott every week. There's plenty of leaders who say a lot of stupid shit.
There are plenty of silly mistakes in Parliament.
We just judge the the sentiment around Monash and thought targeting Tony Abbott in our first week would be...
Not only that, but it was a pretty damn stupid call, and it
That's
was
right.
quite recent. So,
Yeah. And on that, we are going to move on to our next song. There's been a lot of American-hating songs today. Songs like Guerrilla Radio, American Idiot, and Psycho all deal with American government policy. And we think it's about time that we say, yeah, America's pretty awesome. So
Yeah.
this is our patriotic song of the
apart from
week.
its government, of course.
This is Billy Joel. We didn't start the fire. On the airwaves with our last song today, that was Billy Joel with our patriotic song of the week. We didn't start the fire because we know it wasn't America's fault. Everyone just happened to start blaming them for crap.
Exactly.
This next segment is less sexy than ISIS. Put simply, this is an issue that was overshadowed during the week because of headlines saying ISIS, death cult ISIS, etc.
Explosions. But that we got mosque in Yemen. It's pretty bad. Yeah,
News
man.
directed by Michael Bay.
Eh.
This week on Less Sexy Than ISIS, we're going to talk about the oil price war and why your petrol is starting to cost a bit more again. So let's go back to the start. What happened? Saudi Arabia increased the output of their fuel significantly, right to the line at which it would still be profitable to shoot out that many barrels at once. Why did this happen? It's a couple of reasons. Firstly, he's sending a message. It's devaluing oil as a political commodity, as political capital. So, Saudi Arabia's due to nuclear power proliferation in Iran and Russian exports, which they've now doubled because of Ukraine. What's happening is that Saudi Arabia is losing their long-term grip on the region. So what's happened is that Saudi Arabia increased the output to devalue the oil, but more so, without the oil costing as much as it does currently, Russia's economy practically falls apart.
There's another reason that's closer to home. The USA is challenging the Saudi oil monopoly with its own production of oil through fracking.
Yep.
Fracking hell. Oil, be sure to stock up on petrol while you still can, because the fact is, if the Saudis keep driving petrol prices lower, then all the US fracking terms are going to go out of business, and
so
it's all over.
So this is where the USA comes into it. The USA started increasing fuel production in terms of creating crude oil exports, but more so by championing fracking and exporting steam coal gas.
Bit crude of them, don't you think?
The USA competition prompts Saudi Arabia to increase production. What happens, therefore, is that oil is devalued, and it hurts the Russian economy, it hurts the Iranian economy, and therefore hurts their proxy efforts in Syria and
I guess they'll be Russian
Ukraine.
out of Ukraine.
So there's three knock-on effects here. Firstly, the Russian and Iranian export economy is hurt significantly. Secondly, pressure on Russia in Ukraine amounts, and Russia's nuclear proliferation program is also in question. And finally, and most importantly, the biggest effect of this is it changes the use of oil as geopolitical capital. That's just political jargon I thought I'd throw in there. It basically means that you no longer have your weapon. You cannot threaten us. Saudi Arabia is taking back the power by relinquishing the value on that property.
Fair enough.
Yep.
So, speaking of things that bring a tear to your eye, like those beautiful petrol prices, political news from The Onion. So, Hillary Clinton hints at her presidential ambitions, fueling further speculation this week that she has set her sights on the Oval Office. Former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton is said to have hinted at her presidential ambitions by concealing a vast trove of information from the American people. By using a personal email account to keep records out of the hands of investigators in the US populace, Clinton is making it resoundingly clear that she has presidential ambitions, said political analyst Stuart Rothenberg. Clinton's flimsy justifications for her actions and her efforts to deflect blame further prove that she will hardly win the Democratic nomination in 2016.
Handily.
Whoops. Well, that was a bit of a blunder.
American politics from The Onion is always the most accurate way to gauge public outcry because they know exactly what to satire, and we will have some original material coming for you soon.
Exactly. It may help boost our careers. Stay tuned.
Beautiful.
And now, political party. Putting the cool in political.
So, that's it for the show today. And in our first of many weekly traditions, Hamish is going to send us off with his pun of the week.
So, some of these Syrian militants, they must be thinking, well, how did I get from Tajikistan to Syria? Iran.
Thanks, Hamish. Thanks, everyone, for listening. This is Political Party. See you next week.